Welcome to the University of the West Indies, the Department of Literatures and English Cape Lecture Series for 2021. This is the first time that the department will be offering the Literatures and English Cape Lecture Series online. One of the advantages of that is that you will be able to access the lectures at your own convenience after they have been posted. But one of the disadvantages is that you will not have that direct and immediate interaction with the presenter that you would have in a face-to-face situation. So I encourage you to post your questions in the chat. The presenter will be able to see these questions and will respond to them at the end of the presentation. Another disadvantage of the online mode of delivery is that sometimes it can be pretty easy to be distracted in the online classroom. I suggest that you use note-taking as a way of remaining focused. Have your notebook next to you and write notes from the lecture. I expect that many of you intend to continue your studies at university after you've completed your CAPE exam. And I hope that most of you have already applied to the University of the West Indies. Be sure to go on to the Literatures in English website to look at the programs we offer to see if any of them are a fit for you. In addition to our long-standing BA Literatures in English, we also offer a BA in Liberal Studies, a BA in Film Studies, and most recently, a BA in Writing, Literature, and Publishing. If you have any questions or queries, you can contact us using the contact information given on the website. You can easily access the website through the UWI Mona homepage. Click on Faculties and then click on the name of the department. We'd be happy to hear from you. I hope you enjoy our CAPE lecture series, and I hope that you find it instructive and useful as you prepare for your CAPE Literatures in English exams. Good luck in your exams, and I hope to see you at UWI Mona, and especially in the Department of Literatures in English. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Caprice McCleary, and the lecture I'll be delivering this afternoon is When the Past and Present Intersect, the Nine-Night Ceremony as a Structural Technique in an Echoing the Bone. In terms of what we want to achieve this evening, I've simplified it to very simple things. By the end of this lecture, I hope you understand the function of the Nine-Night Ceremony in the play, and secondly, the relationship between the past and the present. And we want to achieve these things through examining these four areas. The first is what a nine-night ceremony is and its use in the play. The second is the treatment of the past in the play and its effect. Third, the past in the play in relation to setting and characterization. And you'll find that we will look also at the implications for plot and action. And then the fourth element is how access to the past through the nine-night ceremony is informative. Let's look at some introductory matters now. And Echoing the Bone was written by Jamaican playwright, writer Dennis Scott. It was first performed in 1974 at the University of the West Indies, Mona, by the University Dramatic Arts Society. Set during the 1930s, the play moves through various episodes in the history of the colonial encounter. And those episodes inform much of the action and the issues in the play. The play starts with a mystery. The beginning of the play is shrouded in mystery. And what is the mystery? Master, as a plantation owner who recently returned to Jamaica, has been murdered. Crew is missing after leaving his wife to request access from Master Charles to the water supply from the river that runs through his property. By the river, they find Crew's bloody machete, clothes, as well as a rum bottle. The community suspects Crew is dead, but they can't be sure. What are the implications for the plot when the narrative, the story, the play starts in this way? Essentially, we're starting at the falling action of the climax between Crew and Master Charles. And so the play begins after the murder. It goes back to the beginning through the other elements of the development of that plot, through flashback. And we look at other terms that critics have used to discuss flashback in the play a little later in the presentation. So it returns to the other elements of plot through flashback. And on occasion, it goes back to the present of the play in the nine-night ceremony. All right, let's look at what a nine-night ceremony is. And I suspect most of you, if you studied the play already, you're familiar with it. But let's just go through very quickly some of the important elements and features that you'd expect to see in a nine-night ceremony. So it's a Jamaican death ritual held on the 9th night after a person's death. It's believed that the person will return home at that point, and so its purpose is to convince the spirit that everything is okay and that they can transition and move on. Some variations and move on to another realm or back to the motherland, which is Africa. The nine-night ceremony involves singing, drumming, dancing, food, and games. And more importantly, the dead is eulogized. So you may hear a very long eulogy, probably longer than what you'd hear in a funeral, at a funeral. And people will recount favorable memories that they have of the person. It's sometimes, especially in the coming of variations, when that is added, it will involve the possession of one of the participants in the ceremony by the deceased person's spirit, sometimes other ancestral spirits. This possession is important because it yields revelations, especially if there is uncertainty surrounding the events of the person's death. And the deceased person, their spirit, may convey their final instructions in terms of burial, etc. All right. Rachel's opening lines in the play are, "Tonight I belong to the dead." When she re-enters later after the spectacle of Dreamboat's possession, she declares, "This is the house of the dead. This is the house of the dead. I welcome you. It is the will of the man that is dead." And certainly the man that is dead, Crew, is invested in the past. The playwright, Dennis Scott, is invested in the past and explores it through the use of flashbacks. And Valerie Beda, in her essay, Slavery and Silence, calls these collective remembering trances. So these flashbacks or collective remembering trances, or you may also see them written in other material as historical vignettes, are subsumed within the ritual, within the structure of this nine-night ceremony. So how does Scott treat the past, and what is the effect of that treatment? Because the nine-night ceremony allows them to access the dead, access the past. And let us look now at how the past is treated within the context of the play. All right, so the present in An Echo in the Bone is the nine-night ceremony. And that occurred, as we stated before, 9 nights after Crew's disappearance. The nine-night provides, so that ritual, that ceremony provides the frame for the action within the play, which attempts to recover elements in the past which led to the murder as a part of its investment in not who committed the murder, because at the end of scene 1, Crew confesses. So it is not so much in terms of the rest of the play, it is not so much about who killed Master Charles, but the play is more invested in why he killed Master Charles. This is important if you are a defense attorney, right? You want to convey the circumstances, the state of mind of your client to sort of present some redeeming qualities. It is also important within a post-colonial context. If you are familiar with how events are told in newspapers, for example, of incidents involving people who were enslaved, you will find that in general, the enslaved, the black men or women, are characterized as vile, drunk, jealous, immoral. And the white man is morally, intellectually superior, and he's just a victim of their barbarism. All right? But beyond vindicating Crew by means of telling us the events that preceded the murder, Scott's project is more ambitious. It goes beyond just a superficial reading of an act of murder, which can only find a little justification when we look at the immediate past. So that is in reference to those events that led up to the murder. The answer of why is also presented in the wider context in this play of a 300-year history of enslavement, violence, and erasure. And what is being erased? Their identity, their history, and their economic means to autonomy. To accomplish this, Scott ventures deep into what we call the bones, if I am to refer to the title of the play. The bones, or the racial memory, or the collective memory of the group. And that is done through the ritual act of possession, which is facilitated by the nine-night ceremony. And the nine-night ceremony then provides insight into the past, the immediate past, insight into the distant past. It can provide catharsis, and we do see that at the end of the play. It provides reconciliation and a change, we hope, in the terms of engagement. Because there are a number of critics who write about the play as a tool of social reform. So Dennis Scott was speaking to an audience in the 1970s, showing them the injustices, the oppression, the exploitation that people in the 1930s would have experienced. But those people in the audience in the 1970s would be experiencing much of that. And we'll look at that a little bit later. All right. So the nine-night ceremony, through access to the past, provides insight, provides catharsis, it provides reconciliation, and that is embedded in the past. Therefore, the nine-night ritual is a powerful structural tool that Scott used to reclaim a past that was otherwise inaccessible. All right, so what is the effect of this? The effect is that we have a punctuation of the past, or a punctuation of the present by events in the past. And let's look at those. If you look at the table there, you'll notice in Act 1 of the play, Act 1 starts with the nine-night ceremony. It is in the present. Then it moves to the distant past, the most distant point that the play refers to. 1792, the slave ship on the coast of Africa. Then it goes 2 days before Madame's shop, goes to 1820. And remember, we said the play is set in the 1930s. And it goes to 1820 at the auctioneer's office in town, 1833 in the woods near an estate. When we get to Act 2, it starts again with the nine-night ceremony, but it quickly goes 4 years ago at Crew's house, last Monday on Crew's farm, last Monday at Mr. Charles' great house. And so what we find is that a number of the incidents and moments that we find in the play are moments from the past, and that must be telling. All right. So we have the punctuation of the present by past. So the present is continuously interrupted by these historical vignettes, and it does challenge. There are two conceptions of time that I can share with you. There's one that's linear, that what is in the past has gone, and we're in the present moving towards the future. The introduction of these historical vignettes challenge that idea that the past is dead and gone. And you'll find some of the younger characters in this play tend to, Bridget says it at the start, Laddie says, no, why are we bothering with this? It is the older ones who are committed to recognizing the past and the dead. And there is a specific reason for this. And we're going to get into that as we go on. So the present is continuously punctuated by the past. There's an insistence in some of the essays. It will say the insistence of the dead, and there's an insistence of the drumming that sort of carries the mood. In a traditional Kumina ceremony or nine-night ceremony, you find the drummer is crucial. So while Rattler, and we will look at him a little later, while he is mute, he is able to manage the possession of people. He's able to play differently to relieve Dreamboat of the spirit, of whose spirit that has possessed him. And even when Rattler does not play, the drumming continues, and he opens his hands and says, I'm not playing, but the drumming continues to maintain that regression or journey into the past. All right, so there's a constant punctuation of the present by the past. And then the second effect is that we sort of find that time has collapsed on itself. So the first one indicates a sort of cyclical nature. In fact, both of them do. They go through these cycles. And that is what, arguably, Scott, the playwright, is trying to share with all of us, that the past can trap us in a kind of cycle. And if we're not aware of it, we tend to repeat the same patterns of behavior. All right, so the effect, the punctuation of the past, the present by the past, and then the second is the sort of collapsing of time. Rachel says 30 years, long like 300. So she's unable, and the other characters are mostly unable to distinguish their short experience with exploitation and the longer, more extensive period of exploitation. It's the same. The exploitation is the same. The oppression is the same. And it is as if they have this 300-year weariness in their bones. So, the past. The past is a strategy. The past is a thematic concern, and Dennis Scott uses the nine-night ceremony to access it, and primarily through spirit possession. It is an engagement with the dead, and that provides revelations. The past is also used to vindicate who, as I outlined earlier. When you find out who the man is, you tend to be more sympathetic to him, in contrast to what the tabloids or periodicals or newspaper would present. So it vindicates him, it memorializes him. And this is important, because if we go to the first scene of the play, it says what in life was like, and the answer in that litany section or call and response, and the response is smoke. And so it is through the nine-night that they're able to capture and recognize that Crew actually existed and that he had some impact on the community around him. So it vindicates, it memorializes Crew. And to add to that, if you consider the monologue that he shares with Rachel, close to the end of the text, near the climax, a part of the rising action of the play, his explanation of what the land means to him, I think that is probably the most powerful vindication of the man. And to elaborate a little more here, because what the play does, by going back to 4 years before the murder, when Mas Charles re-enters the story or the play, we find him entering in a particular way. He entered as Lord Overall. And we find the use of foreshadowing as Sun holds on to his cutlass when he feels disrespected by Mas Charles. And it builds with this added context of a relationship, a sexual relationship between Rachel and Mas Charles, and his disregard and disrespect for her. So Rachel's decision to go up to the estate to accept the job as housekeeper, and that has a particular significance, sort of going back to a position of enslavement, but greater significance because of that relationship between them and its disrespect shows Rachel's desperation and the desperation of the family. All right, so it has that function in terms of adding to Crew's story. The past is also used to interrogate received history. And what do I mean by received history? It is about the history that initially was given to the people in the Caribbean. And so even Bridget, in the second scene of the play on the slave ship in 1792, refers, and so that's an example of intertextuality. She refers to a novel written about that. Let me see. She refers to a novel written about that. about, and it presents the received history of the people. All right, so it interrogates history, because what we find is that history is also reimagined, and that instead of a colonial perspective where the active participants are the colonizers, in this play we have the opposite. In this play we have the story of the people who were below deck in the hold. We have the story of their trauma, of their pain, and so it is adding and completing that text. And then the final aspect I want to just touch on in relation to how the past is treated by the play is that it is activated to respond. Sorry for that concealment. It's activated to respond to the realities that the characters face in the present. And that is where I'm going to close off the presentation later. All right, so the past and the present, what are the implications for setting and characterization? And this is a useful way to prepare us for writing an essay, for example. So I want us to look more closely at this relationship and what it means for setting and characters. So the motive here is sameness. Everything is the same. The setting and conditions of their existence are the same. The stories are the same. The traits the characters exhibit are the same. And therefore, this intersection between the present and the past through the nine-night ceremony reveals that the characters are caught in certain cycles of trauma. Remember, I mentioned the effect of the treatment of the past that is punctuated and punctured consistently by the present, is punctured consistently by the past. And so we get a sort of going around in circles. And because they're the same, we get the sense that the characters are in fact caught in a cycle, that Prue's murder is not isolated, it's a part of a wider picture, that the behavior of some characters is not isolated, but a part of a bigger picture, of a sort of recycling of trauma, recycling of behavior and character traits. All right? And this, I suggest, is what the echo in the bone is. So let's look at setting. All right, the collective remembering trances reveal that little has changed for the Blacks since enslavement. They are still oppressed. Even though they are free, the white men and women still own the means of production. They own the markets, and in Prue's case, I mean, they have the water, they have access to the water that is crucial for the maintenance of a farm. The characters also speak about this. In Act 1, P says, 300 years crying into the white man's ground to make the cane green, and nothing to show. And several things are happening here. I mean, one, in terms of what we're discussing, that nothing has changed. They have nothing to show, having emerged from that position of servitude. And then the other is that it really reinforces what we've been talking about in terms of the collapsing of time, that it is as if Crew, P, Stone, all the characters have experienced this 300 years of labor, and there's nothing for them to show. In Act 2, Stone says, I see the inside of the offices sometimes, and the big house that they built from 200 years ago, when all of us, notice the collapsing of time, right? They were there. All of us worked the land for nothing, like animals. You think things change now? Your skin, and P says, we're free. And Stone's response to him is, your skin white then, Mass P? To them, you is still dirt, and nothing you say will change the way they look at you. And so you get the sense that they are stuck in this moment, even though it seems as if they're progressing because they're now free. It is post-emancipation, but they're still stuck in the conditions of their servitude, the conditions of oppression. In recalling the past in post-colonial drama, the rest of it is from counter-history to socio-political redress. The authors argue that the authors argue that not much has changed between the 1930s, in which the play is set, and the 1970s, in which, or at the time at which Dennis Scott wrote and presented the play. Because the whites, the plantation owners, former plantation owners, still exploited them. So there were still high rates of poverty and joblessness. The authors also indicate that the life of rural peasants remained the same for all of those years until the play was staged. And this is in reference to that same essay. So this quote says, the recurrent notion of cyclicity, so how cyclical history is, it goes around in circle, you never seem to leave that particular place and condition, at least within these dramas. So the recurrent notion of cyclicity in history in these plays projects what we conceive as the ethical role of the post-colonial playwright as social reformers who crave to achieve and protect the principles of social justice among their communities. In other words, it is a two-step. The playwrights in their plays show how cyclical history is. They show that things have not changed. And that recognition or awareness moves them into social reform. And I suggest too that by the end of the play, having gone through and experienced those collective remembering trances, the characters are now more acutely aware of the cyclicity of history, the ways in which they keep repeating the trauma and the same kinds of behaviors. And they move to now a transformation of their approach and response to oppression. All right, so we've looked at setting, and the setting is that not much has changed. What about the characters? I find it very interesting that even though the characters are the same, we still have the 10 same characters. Errol Hill, in the introduction to this play, in the text that I assume you have placed for today, indicates that, the nine-night ceremony is a brilliant theatrical choice because it is an economical way to show all of these many varied important historical moments. It maintains the tension in the play because you don't have to be changing scenes and moving furniture. You can maintain the atmosphere there. And the final thing he notes is that it's useful in terms of characters. Imagine if you had to cast characters for all of those different scenes. So the nine-night facilitates that because we expect possession to happen in the nine-night ceremony, but it doesn't. It doesn't for everybody. So we expect possession to happen in the nine-night ceremony, and so we are okay, the audience accepts that these characters can embody others. In this section, we're going to look at how the characters now sort of present issues of trauma and character traits that are recycled. So go with me through this table. Dreamboat. Dreamboat demonstrates selfishness. Dreamboat is a selfish character. And evidence of that, and this is Dreamboat in the present. 2 days ago, that is at the shop, he says, man have to look out for himself. And what is the context for this? Dream went hunting in the hills and he caught a pig or a wild hog. And he comes to Madame's shop begging her cheese, but he is hiding the hog. He's not willing to share it. We find a selfishness, a self-centeredness, a disregard for others, even how he talks about Lally. And we find that very common trait with Dream in the present. If we look at the scene that follows it, and we can also pay attention to how Scott transitions between scenes, because the scene at Madame's shop ends with a fish vendor, a vendor who is shouting that fish is for sale. And the next scene in which Dream plays a significant role, and that is 1820 in the auctioneer's office, or at the auctioneer's office. He's what? Selling slaves on behalf of his master. All right? So, and that scene, the transition was what I was mentioning. We have the vendor at the end of that scene at Madame's shop, and just before the scene in 1820, and the vendor says, orange, sweet and mellow, orange, green and yellow, buy your right banana, fresh fish, fresh orange, orange butter, butterfish, fresh fish. This bargaining and trading, and you find the women, Bridget and Lally, are treated in much the same way. And the issue with this is that Prue is extremely complicit with the trading and enslavement of his own people. And the complicity comes from this selfishness that has been taught to him is really a traumatic response. He's been taught, I mean, because the idea within colonization or slavery is that, you know, you divide them and you rule. So if I want to protect my own skin, I'm going to act in a way that does that, regardless of whomever I hurt. And so he is extremely selfish. And we see that demonstrated there. That important monologue in 1820 reinforces his complicity with the system. So two things there for Dreamboat: selfishness, and he demonstrates that in the present, the characters he embodies in the past also demonstrates that same selfishness. It's an individualistic approach to oppression. And so if we go back to the scene at Madame's shop, when he says a man have to look out for himself, P responds because there's really another way to respond to oppression. There's a communal, collective response where you protect each other. And P says to him, my son, all are we poor and all are we black. But sometimes like put the stone down harder on some than the rest. Then you have to stop and think for yourself. Think that you're lucky is you alone in the world, you're young and strong. Then if the stone crush you, it's only you alone suffer. So while you take this selfish approach, there is a danger of when the boot comes down on you, or when you are being oppressed and exploited, beaten or killed, you are the only one to bear that pain. And this is actually present in the play itself, this distinction between someone who is on his own and someone who has the support of the community. And in the second scene, and that is on the slave ship in 1792, Dream comes aboard on deck and he's barely conscious, he's very ill. And you see the communication between P and Stone, and they say, okay, they kick him, and he did not respond, and so they push him overboard. And the text says, you know, no one, they barely saw. Compare that to when they removed Rattler's tongue. What do you have at the end of that scene? And let me just find that quickly. The group, and I'm on page 86. The group shuffles, clambers, drifts, marches, stumbles back to the hole. Rachel stops, looks back at the body of Rattler. So there's recognition of his presence and pain, unlike Dream, who's just kicked overboard. Pause, looks at Son-Son. Son-Son goes back to him cautiously, watched by Stone and P, lifts, drags him over to the hold. The group, look at what the group do. Pay attention to that. The group pass him silently between themselves, very gently down into the hold along the chain. And so there's a protection that is afforded the group when they care for each other. Dream has chosen to sort of isolate himself from that. And even though this is not the same character, it's not the same Dream, we note that these kinds of traits recur throughout the text. Let's look at Rattler. Rattler, we know, is voiceless. In the present of the play, he's mute. He plays the drum. And if we're looking at voicelessness as a thematic concern in the play, of course you're going to note that. You're going to note the removal of Rattler's tongue, that literal action that symbolizes the removal or voicelessness of an entire people who were trafficked across the Middle Passage to the quote-unquote New World. So that action is symbolic. And we find Rattler in the present is mute. In the ship, the characters suggest, Lally suggests that, you know, if we are moved, if we're together, we'll all have to learn to speak one language. So we find that even though Rattler is mute, even though the characters are voiceless, to the extent that they don't have a voice in history, their stories are not being told, they find ways to retool themselves. Rattler drums, and that is a powerful tool in that ritual. The other characters are throughout history, they learn to speak one language. Jacko talks about using one language. He says, "A black day busher, when you teach us, you taught us your tongue." And now what is the word they are coalescing around? The word is freedom. And so they've been able to retool. In 1820, Rattler writes, and he writes eloquently. All right, so that's Rattler, this voicelessness that seems to recur. In other words, we're looking at cycles of selfishness as a learned behavior. You want to save yourself at the expense of your people, but you want to save yourself. There's voicelessness that recurs. Some groups that are so marginalized that you don't hear they're part of the narrative. And the play as a whole works to redress this issue, because by presenting these historical vignettes or these collective remembering trances or the cinematic flashback, what Scott is doing is giving voice back to those persons who could not speak, who could not tell their story and their pain. All right, let's look at the third character, and that character is Sun Sun. There is an instinctive violence that Sun Sun demonstrates that is also characteristics, a traumatic response to a condition that thrives and is maintained by violence. When we meet the slavers in the second scene, we find them using violence. P, after delivering his soliloquy in the crow's nest, says, "Save one for me," because he wants to beat one. He wants to enjoy the whipping. And so they've found themselves in these kinds of situations where violence is meted out to them. And so violence becomes a natural response. How does Sun Sun demonstrate that? And how does Scott present him in that way? In the stage directions that start the play, Sun Sun is described as a violent man of 25. In Act 2, when he encounters Master Charles, he doesn't know it is him initially. He encounters Master Charles and he feels extremely disrespected by Master Charles. What does he do? He holds on to his cutlass, and that acts as a foreshadowing of what his father will eventually do to Master Charles. So note the use of flashback, particularly in relation to Sun Sun, who becomes the embodiment of Crew in the play, because Crew is absent. Crew does not exist as a character outside of Sun Sun. All right, so they mirror each other in that sense. So that is Sun Sun in the present, a violent man of 25. In Act 2, his response to the disrespect from Master Charles is to hold on to his cutlass. Look at the character he plays in 1833, and that is on page 96. And this is that, we can look at Sun Sun and Jacko as foils for each other, because Jacko embodies this instinctive, violent response to oppression, to violence, to trauma. And Jacko has a more strategic approach or response. So let us look at Sun Sun in 1833. So we're mapping them, what the characters embody in the present and who they play in the past. So on page 96, Jacko asks Sun Sun, what you think we're going to gain by killing him? Because Jacko suggests, let us kill the plantation owner that they caught while he was chasing a runaway slave. Sun Sun says, yeah, one less. Jacko says, that's not enough. Sun Sun replies, you think he would think twice about it if he was holding the knife? So the violence there is reactive, it is instinctive and not thoughtful. And Jacko says, you're going to kill and kill till the whole island run red, and then what? And Sun Sun says, then we start again. It is a myopic, narrow-minded kind of response to these situations of exploitation and violence. And that is the danger in which Crew has found himself. That Crew's response like Sun Sun, and that is why it is fitting that Sun Sun, in that very dramatic moment in scene 1, and it creates spectacle. Sun Sun puts on Crew's clothes. He's inviting Crew's spirit to possess him. And it's significant that Sun Sun is the one that is chosen to carry his spirit. or has chosen himself to carry spirit, because the violence, this instinctive violence, seems common. And then between Sonson and Jacko, we have that foil, that difference. So Sonson's instinctive traumatic response is violence in the present of the play, and he embodies characters that show those same traits. Jacko, on the other hand, takes a different approach. On page 97, so I'm in the past for Jacko right now. On page 97, he says, he outlines a sort of approach. And the approach is offering this olive branch to the white man who is played by Stone. I'm going to set you free and show that we are superior. I'm going to offer you mercy. So I'm not going to respond instinctively, blindly, and turn everything on its head before we can manage the situation properly. So I'm offering you, and it's a peace gesture. And he says, I'm going to give you time to think about your ideology, whether or not you still will believe in a number of years, in this case is 1 year, that we are inferior to you. And if those things don't work, then he says the gun and knife will decide who is right. So it's important here that within the play, in the context of the play, it does not appear that Scott is anti-violence. He's anti or more critical of violence that is instinctive, that is responsive to colonial trauma. The approach of Jacko is the one that is celebrated in the text. And when we get to the final section, I'll discuss that some more. But here in this same scene in 1833, in the woods, Jacko presents that strategic response to oppression. The final characters I will look at in relation, so what we're mapping here, just to sort of remind you, we're looking at the relationship between the past and the present. We looked at it in relation to the characters, the setting, and the fact that the setting in the past, the conditions of their existence in the past, in the present, are the same. We're now looking at the characters. Who are the characters now? Who are the characters they embody? And are they showing the same cycles of behavior that the 9-night ceremony hopefully will rid them of? All right. So the last two I want to look at are Bridget and Lally. And the thematic concern related to them is this sexual exploitation of women. And you could argue beyond that, the body, this lack of autonomy that is given to the bodies of Africans. So it's not just women, but here I'm narrowing it down to that. In 1820, you see how their bodies are prodded and touched and fondled, in the same way that the vendor is selling fish and other produce, and when you're furnishing those items, you fondle it. This disregard for the Black woman's body. Bridget appears to be, so Bridget and Lally are really foils for each other as well. Lally demonstrates this indiscriminate openness to sexual relationships with men, and we see that with Drebo's response to her. Bridget, on the other hand, chose one brother, chose one foil over the other. She chose Jacko because Sonson did not offer her the kind of security that she needed so that she could rid herself from that same cycle. So she says in that monologue on page 105, but I born poor, you hear me, and black, and the only thing I have is my pride. I don't have anything, but I have a right to answer no. And the truth is, they did not have, you go back to 1820, that right was not afforded to them. And so she's actively claiming that right to say no, unlike Lally. She said, Black people used to work this land for nothing. They used to treat them like beasts. And I want you to note this animal metaphor that is consistent in terms of the colonial perspective in relation to Black people. So that beast or animal metaphor is a motif in the play. All right, so she says, they used to treat them like beasts. They could have mount them anytime. I'm not breeding for any man just because of pleasure. I is not an animal, I is a human being. And so she really touches at this conundrum, this challenge that the women have. after having been taught that they don't own their bodies. Bridget, I think, has been afforded the benefit of an awareness of the past, because what she's doing, in that monologue that I just read, is she's making a reference to the past, and that understanding and awareness of the past is what is moving her to transform her behavior. It has moved her to pick Jacko rather than Son Son. All right, so we are looking at the ways in which these characters are also caught in the cycle where they're repeating the same behaviors. Finally, what does the Nine-Night, what does the access to the past that the Nine-Night provides do for them? And let me start at number 3, because that's where I just left off with the characters. They become aware of the cycles of trauma that have bound them. One critic, forgive me, I can't remember the name, talks about the fact that they're possessed by the past, frees them of possession by the past. And simply that means that because they were possessed by the past, they have access, they see the past and understand the past, they are no longer possessed in a sort of blind repetition of particular behaviors. So if we go back to Son Son and the violence, we see Jacko, who is sort of called back to himself by Bridget. She says, this is inside of you. I know. This is why I chose you. You are smart enough. You can wait. You're patient enough in order to get Son Son down. And so what that essentially did, by Jacko getting Son Son down, and he does that through tricking his father, telling his father that, it's just, there's no blood, it's hog blood on you. The animal metaphor again. It's hog blood on you. I made a bet. You have to come and fight because I have to win. What he did for Crew was change the resolution of the play. So no longer did Crew kill Master Charles as far as Crew is concerned. He's sort of redeemed by Jacko's intervention. And that is what the Nine-Night did for the community. It provided healing for Crew. It saved Son Son from repeating his father's cycles of violence. Through the Nine-Night ceremony, we have access to Bridget's understanding of autonomy over her body. Through the Nine-Night, we hope Dream learns to be less selfish. Rachel ends it with a call for them to play, for Rattler to play for them to hold on to each other and support each other. So access to the past through the Nine-Night is transformative. It provided justification for the murder. We understood through the monologues that Crew presented. We understood through the characterization of Master Charles as sort of maintaining that attitude that he is Lord and controls everything. He has a right to the land. He has a right to the women. So that is a part of the vindication or justification of the murder. And as I said, that justification operates on 2 levels. The immediate past, with the building of the rising action to the murder, and also this wider context that's presented by the other historical vignettes. It's the Nine-Night transformed or changed the resolution of the play. No longer, as far as the play is concerned, did Crew kill Master Charles. He's free of that burden, and so the dead is now able to peacefully transition. And by freeing Crew, he frees Son Son, who appears or re-emerges as new and different. And as I said, if we look back now at the characters, just map, if you can, the character in the present, their traits, and map the qualities that they embody in the past, then you will see that they're repeating some cycles. And the purpose of the access to the past that is provided in the present through the Nine-Night is to transform them, to free them of that cycle. So that is the end of my presentation today. I do hope it was useful, and I'll now look for the questions to see how best I can respond to them. All right. So can you say Rattler's voicelessness is representative of the oppression of the Africans physically, but the drum is used as a form of resistance culturally and definitely. So the voicelessness, the removal of his tongue operates on many levels. The first one is it's a physical act of violence. And you'll notice that physical acts of violence are motifs in this text. And even the character Spear Stone says the land is crying out for blood because violence has been sort of endemic to that situation. So the first is it's a physical act of violence. It is symbolic because he can no longer speak. And they have removed the voice of all of those Africans who were taken from their homeland. They are no longer able, they are sort of taken out of history. They're ahistorical. They can't, I mean, we can't trace our ancestry to Africa. We can trace our ancestry maybe to a document, a bill of sale for a slave. And so there is a voicelessness, an extent to it, or the extent to which we have been outside of history and storytelling. And this form of resistance that you mentioned in your question, the drum, yes, is a form of resistance because it harks back to African traditional forms of communication, of spirituality, and its function in the nine-night ceremony as one of those same things. So the nine-night ceremony operates as a site of resistance because it goes back to this idea of the legitimacy of our Africanness, of our African cultural forms. It brings the community together. The nine-night is not an individual kind of event. It brings the community together, and it's supposed to bring healing to the dead and peace to the living, and it does that. So yes, voicelessness represents the oppression physically and the silencing of this particular group of people. And as I said in the presentation, Rattler is able to retool, and the retooling is powerful. The drum manages the possession in the nine-night ceremony. It establishes and maintains that link to the dead and to the past. The Africans, so we're looking at Rattler literally, but if we look at how figuratively the Africans in Jamaica have been able to retool, they've been able to retool by learning one language. And they've been able to retool by bonding together. Jacko said the word is freedom. And so the use of language to bring them together to fight for their freedom is also another one. Just looking if there are any other questions. No more questions. All right, thank you so much for joining. If there are any questions that you have later, you can post it on the YouTube page and I'll look and respond as well. Thank you very much.